There's a version of this story almost nobody expects because it runs completely opposite to what people assume happens after you break someone who loved you well. The assumption is always some version of misery, grief, decline, a slow unraveling. What actually happens in case after case is stranger than that, and far less satisfying if you were hoping for a story about suffering. Today we're talking about the actual documented shape of what happens to an empath after they're finally genuinely broken, and why the honest answer will surprise you more than any revenge fantasy ever could. Let's start with the assumption we need to dismantle first, because it shapes everything people expect from this topic. There's a common belief, reinforced by how we usually talk about heartbreak, that breaking someone means diminishing them. Smaller, sadder, less capable, permanently worse off for having trusted the wrong person. This belief makes intuitive sense, and it's sometimes even true in the short term, for the first weeks or months after a genuine rupture. But it is almost never the actual, long-term shape of what happens to an empath specifically, and understanding why requires understanding something counterintuitive about where an empath's energy has actually been going the entire time you knew them. Here's the uncomfortable truth, for anyone who's ever taken an empath for granted. Loving you well, patiently, generously, was never free. It was a massive, ongoing expenditure of exactly the resources: attention, creativity, emotional bandwidth, sheer daily energy, that would otherwise have gone toward their own ambitions, their own health, their own unfinished projects and unspoken dreams. An empath in a relationship where they're doing enormous amounts of unreciprocated emotional labor is, functionally, running two full-time jobs: their actual life and the invisible, unpaid work of managing yours. When that relationship ends, badly, painfully, in whatever way finally broke it, something happens that almost nobody predicts, including the empath themselves, in the immediate aftermath. An entire, enormous reserve of energy that used to be permanently allocated elsewhere suddenly, all at once, becomes available again. This is the first shock, and it's worth sitting with directly because it explains everything that follows. The breaking doesn't create a deficit. It reveals one that was always there, hidden underneath years of overextension, and the moment that overextension stops, what gets freed up tends to be far more significant than anyone, including the empath, initially expects. Let's talk about where this freed up capacity actually goes, because this is the second shock, and it's the one that tends to catch everyone off guard, including people who witnessed the relationships ending up close and assumed they knew exactly how the story would unfold from there. The first thing that tends to happen, a burst of creative or professional output that seems, from the outside, almost inexplicably fast, given how recently the relationship ended. A project that had been stalled for years suddenly moves forward. A career shift that felt impossible while managing someone else's constant needs suddenly becomes not just possible, but urgent, almost unstoppable. This isn't resilience in the vague, motivational sense people usually mean when they use that word. It's simple, mechanical redirection, years of energy that used to be spent managing someone else's moods, someone else's crises, someone else's unmet needs, now pouring directly into the empath's own work at a volume and intensity that was never actually available to them, while that energy was being constantly diverted elsewhere. The second thing that tends to happen, and one of the more quietly devastating developments for anyone who assumed the empath would be permanently diminished: a rapid, sometimes startling improvement in physical health. Chronic tension headaches that had persisted for years, unexplained by any doctor, resolve within weeks of the relationship's end. Sleep that had been fragmented and shallow for a decade suddenly deepens and stabilizes. Digestive issues, unexplained fatigue, a general low-grade physical depletion that had simply become the empath's baseline, quietly reverses, revealing that a significant portion of what felt like normal aging or ordinary stress was actually the direct physiological cost of years spent in a state of constant, low-grade emotional vigilance, managing someone else's instability. The third thing that tends to happen, the sudden, often surprising deepening of relationships that had been quietly starved for years, without anyone fully realizing how starved they'd actually become. Friendships that had drifted into occasional, surface-level contact because there simply wasn't enough energy left over to maintain them properly, suddenly bloom back into something rich and sustaining, almost overnight, once the empath actually has attention available to invest in them again. Family relationships that had grown distant not through any conflict, but through simple depletion, often experience a similar rapid deepening, revealing that the distance was never actually about lack of care. It was about lack of remaining capacity, entirely consumed by managing one specific, demanding relationship that's now gone. The fourth thing, and perhaps the most surprising to people who expected permanent damage, a genuinely improved, rather than diminished, capacity for future intimacy. This runs directly against the popular assumption that being hurt badly makes someone more guarded, more closed off, less capable of real connection going forward. What actually tends to happen, once the immediate grief has been metabolized rather than avoided, is closer to the opposite. An empath who's finally released years of one-sided emotional labor often discovers they have more genuine warmth available for a new connection than they'd had in years, precisely because that warmth is no longer being drained by managing a relationship that was quietly consuming it faster than it could replenish. I want to talk about why this pattern, energy redirected rather than destroyed, health restored rather than damaged, relationships deepened rather than lost, capacity for intimacy increased rather than diminished, surprises almost everyone, including the person it happens to. Part of the reason is cultural. We're conditioned to expect heartbreak to follow a specific narrative arc, one where loss produces decline, where being hurt makes someone smaller, more fragile, more permanently affected. This narrative isn't entirely wrong. It does describe what happens in the first weeks, sometimes months, immediately following a genuine rupture. But it describes a phase, not a destination, and most cultural narratives about heartbreak simply stop paying attention before the actual, longer arc has a chance to reveal itself. The other reason this pattern surprises people is more specific to empaths in particular. Because their labor was invisible for so long, its removal is equally invisible in its immediate effects, meaning nobody, including the empath, has an accurate baseline for what their actual capacity looks like once it's no longer being constantly siphoned off elsewhere. You cannot know how much energy you've been spending managing someone else's emotional world until that management stops entirely, and the sudden appearance of energy, health, and capacity that had simply been unavailable for years often produces genuine shock, even in the person experiencing it directly because they'd forgotten, or perhaps never fully realized in the first place, what their own baseline actually was without that constant drain. I want to say something important about why this reframe matters. Beyond simply being an interesting or surprising fact about recovery patterns, it changes something significant about how the entire story of breaking an empath should actually be understood. The popular narrative treats this as a story of damage inflicted, and damage by its nature implies something is now permanently lessened, permanently worse off than before. The actual pattern we're describing today tells a different story. Not damage, but liberation, disguised initially as loss, arriving in a form painful enough that its actual nature, the sudden freeing of years of siphoned-off capacity, takes real time to become visible, even to the person it's happening to. This doesn't mean the initial pain isn't real. It absolutely is. And nothing in this reframe should be read as minimizing the genuine grief, genuine disorientation, and genuine difficulty of the immediate aftermath of losing a relationship that mattered, however unbalanced it may have been. What it means is that the story doesn't end at the point where most narratives about heartbreak stop paying attention. It continues, often in a direction few people, including the empath themselves, would have predicted from inside the pain of the initial break. I want to be honest about something before we move into the second half of this conversation, because it matters for how this reframe actually gets used. None of this happens automatically, simply through the passage of time. The redirection of energy, the restoration of health, the deepening of other relationships, the expanded capacity for future intimacy, all of it requires the empath to actually notice and actively participate in what's becoming available to them, rather than remaining passively oriented backward toward the relationship that ended, waiting for grief alone to resolve into something new without any deliberate engagement in that process. And that's exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What it actually takes to consciously redirect this newly available capacity, rather than letting it dissipate unused. Why some empaths successfully make this shift within months, while others take years to even notice the capacity exists. And why understanding this entire pattern in advance is one of the most protective, most genuinely useful pieces of information an empath can carry into the aftermath of any relationship that finally, painfully breaks. Let's talk about what it actually takes to consciously redirect this newly available capacity, because leaving it purely to time and instinct, without any deliberate engagement, is exactly why some empaths take years to notice what's become available to them, while others make this shift within months. The difference isn't luck. It's a specific set of practices, and understanding them changes an unconscious drifting process into something you can actually participate in. Here's the first requirement, and it's counterintuitive for anyone expecting a story about immediately, energetically rebuilding. Allowing the initial grief to actually be felt in full, rather than rushing past it toward the redirected energy we described in the first half. This matters because grief that gets skipped rather than genuinely metabolized doesn't actually disappear. It tends to resurface later, often in ways that quietly sabotage exactly the redirection we're describing, showing up as a strange, unexplained inability to fully enjoy the newly available creative output, the restored health, the deepened friendships. Because some part of the mind is still occupied processing something it was never actually given the chance to finish feeling. The empaths who successfully redirect this energy fastest are, somewhat counterintuitively, often the ones who allowed themselves the most honest, unhurried grief first, rather than the ones who tried to immediately convert pain into productivity as a way of avoiding it. The second requirement, actually noticing and naming the specific capacity that's become available, rather than experiencing it as vague, unexplained energy without connecting it to its actual source. This sounds simple, but it's genuinely easy to miss, because the capacity often arrives gradually, in small increments, rather than announcing itself clearly. An empath who deliberately pauses, periodically, to ask, "What do I actually have more of right now than I did 6 months ago?" tends to notice and capitalize on this shift far faster than one who simply waits for it to become undeniable before acknowledging it exists at all. This naming matters because what gets named becomes something you can actually direct on purpose, rather than something that simply happens to you passively, in whatever direction momentum happens to carry it. The third requirement, and one of the more practically important ones, actively choosing where to direct this newly available capacity, rather than assuming it will automatically flow toward whatever's most valuable or most fulfilling. This is important because energy, once freed, doesn't have any inherent sense of direction. Left unguided, it can just as easily flow into anxious rumination, into obsessive monitoring of the person who caused the original break, into a new relationship entered too quickly simply to fill the space, as it can flow into genuinely nourishing pursuits like creative work, health, or deepened existing relationships. The empaths who make the most of this period tend to be the ones who deliberately, consciously choose specific destinations for this capacity, a project, a health goal, a specific friendship worth reinvesting in, rather than leaving the direction entirely up to whatever happens to feel most immediately soothing in any given moment. The fourth requirement, resisting the very natural temptation to prove something to the person who caused the break, rather than simply building for its own sake. This distinction matters enormously because energy redirected toward proving a point, building a visibly impressive life, specifically so the other person will see it, hear about it, regret what they lost, tends to remain tethered to that person indefinitely, meaning the empath never actually achieves full redirection at all. It simply changes the form of their continued orientation around someone who no longer deserves that much of their attention. Genuine redirection requires building toward things that would matter, even if the other person never found out about any of it, which is a subtly but significantly different orientation than building specifically to be seen or regretted. The fifth requirement, and the one that ties everything else together, patience with the actual timeline this process requires, because it rarely unfolds as quickly or as linearly as the shocks we described in the first half might suggest. Some of what we discussed, the burst of creative output, the physical health improvements, can happen relatively quickly, sometimes within the first few months. But the deeper redirection, the kind that produces a genuinely, sustainably different life, rather than simply a temporary burst of activity that eventually fades, tends to require sustained effort over a much longer period. Often a year or more, sometimes considerably longer, depending on how deeply the original overextension had become embedded into the empath's entire way of operating. I want to talk about why some empaths make this shift within months while others take years, because the difference matters practically, not just theoretically. The empaths who move through this fastest tend to share a specific combination of traits: genuine willingness to feel the initial grief fully rather than avoiding it, active curiosity about their own newly available capacity rather than passive waiting, and enough existing support, friends, family, sometimes professional help, to actually process what happened rather than working through it entirely alone. The empaths who take considerably longer tend to be missing one or more of these elements, often the last one specifically. Processing a significant rupture entirely alone, without any outside perspective to help distinguish genuine redirection from unhealthy avoidance, tends to significantly slow this entire process, sometimes for years, simply because there's nobody available to help notice when energy has started flowing in an unhelpful direction, allowing that misdirection to continue far longer than it would if someone else were paying attention alongside them. I want to say something important about why understanding this entire pattern matters, specifically for anyone currently on the other side of causing this kind of break. Anyone who's the person who took someone's patient, generous love for granted, and who's wondering, now, what actually happens to the person they hurt? The honest answer, based on everything we've discussed today, tends to be genuinely humbling in a way the popular narrative of "make them suffer" never quite captures. They very likely don't remain diminished. They very likely become more capable, more vibrant, more genuinely themselves than they were able to be while spending years managing a relationship that was quietly consuming resources they never fully realized they had. This isn't karmic punishment in the dramatic sense people sometimes hope for. It's simply what tends to happen, mechanically, when an enormous amount of previously misallocated capacity finally becomes available for its rightful owner to actually use. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this episode. Picture a great tree, standing at the edge of a garden, its roots slowly, over many years, wrapped and constrained by a section of old, buried fencing that was never meant to be there permanently, installed for some temporary purpose long since forgotten, left in place far longer than it should have been, quietly restricting the tree's growth in ways nobody above the surface could actually see. The tree still grew, still produced leaves, still looked from a distance like any other healthy tree in that garden. But underneath, its roots had been working constantly, straining against a constraint that was never supposed to be permanent, spending enormous energy simply pushing against something that should never have been there in the first place. Then, one day, someone finally, painfully, removes that old fencing. Not gently, not with careful preparation, but abruptly. The way roots sometimes get exposed and disturbed during any significant, unplanned disruption. For a period afterward, the tree looks worse, not better. Some leaves brown and fall. The disturbance itself, visible above ground, looks like damage, like decline, exactly the kind of narrative people expect to see after any significant rupture. But underneath, something remarkable is actually happening, invisible from above during those first difficult weeks. Roots that had been straining against an artificial constraint for years are finally, for the first time, free to spread in directions they were never previously able to reach. And given enough time, not weeks, but seasons, sometimes years, that same tree doesn't simply recover to where it was before. It often surpasses it considerably, growing taller, more resilient, more fully itself than it had ever been capable of becoming, while its roots were quietly, invisibly constrained by something that should never have been left in place as long as it was. This is what actually happens, more often than the popular narrative admits, to an empath finally, painfully broken free from a relationship that was quietly constraining far more of their actual capacity than either they or anyone around them ever fully realized. The visible disturbance, in those first difficult weeks, looks like exactly what everyone expects: damage, decline, something diminished. But given time, given honest grief, given deliberate attention to what's actually become available underneath the surface, what tends to grow back isn't smaller. It's finally remarkably free to become everything it was always capable of being. Once the thing that had been quietly constraining it for years was finally, however painfully, removed.